welcome to Bad Ideas, the show where we look at misfires, mistakes, and miscalculations from all throughout history.
I'm Tony Southcott.
And I'm Albert Berg, and the bad idea for today, Tony, is the Hubble Space Telescope.
Maybe not so much the Hubble in general, just how it was originally shipped.
Yes, the idea of having a telescope in space, just in general, goes way back to the very beginning of when we were seriously thinking about rocketry. A guy named Hermann Oberth, who's one of the fathers of modern rocketry, was proposing this idea back in 1923. And of course, back then, we were shooting rockets up, we were developing eventually liquid fuel rockets, like that technology was progressing, but it didn't really become viable until World War II and the sort of German collective that we got over here going with NASA with Werner von Braun started really putting rockets to their limits and what they could really do. And as the space race was progressing, we put some small-scale space-based astronomy stuff up, but scientists wanted more. They wanted something bigger. Now, the value of having a telescope up in orbit, Tony, is that you don't have to deal with the pesky atmosphere getting in the way of your light from your star. So the problem with having a telescope on the ground is, no matter how big you make your mirror and how clear your image is in theory, the fact that the starlight has to punch all the way through the atmosphere and get to where you are means that there's an upper limit to how high your definition in your telescope can be.
Yeah, it's a lot of air particles.
Yes, and when you put a telescope in the orbit of the Earth, you don't have to deal with that. You've got nothing but the vacuum of space between you and your object. And so NASA in the early 1970s starts trying to get a telescope, a big telescope, put up into space. Now, this telescope, which was not named the Hubble yet when they first start thinking about it, was going to be a reflecting telescope. Not like the kind with lenses that you may have seen where there's glass between the viewer and the object that they're looking at, but rather the kind where the light bounces off a bent mirror against another bent mirror, and that magnifies what you're looking at. So you needed a real big curved mirror that was ground incredibly precisely, and it had to make it up into outer space, along with a lot of other technical stuff that they had to deal with to make this thing happen.
Sounds like some very, very sensitive equipment.
Yes, and big projects like this cost big bucks, right? And back in the 1970s, as it is now, and has been frequently throughout the history of NASA, Congress was pushing back on a lot of these budgetary requests. NASA wanted a lot of money, and they wanted the Hubble to be able to do a lot of things, and they just could not get the money that they really wanted to put this purely scientific instrument up into orbit. Like, the Hubble was never going to be a strategic asset. They weren't going to be flying over Russian factories taking pictures with it. It wasn't that kind of thing, so Congress didn't see the need to really put the bucks on the line, and that is sort of where the problem started. They had this attitude of penny pinching, where they wanted to get as much done as they could for as little money as possible. And there was a lot of pressure on NASA when they first go to Congress with this idea to keep the cost down. Because if they come to Congress with $1 billion price tag for pretty pictures of stars, Congress is going to say, no way, my constituents aren't going to vote for me if I do that, and send them packing. So in 1978, they get approved for $36 million to launch this thing into orbit, which is, I think even back then, pretty small potatoes money for what this was going to cost.
I was going to say, for most rocketry things, there's usually a B attached to the dollars part of it.
They had planned to get this thing into orbit by 1983, and by the time 1978 rolls around, don't forget, they had already been in and out with Congress on approvals and then cancellations. This project had already been through the ringer trying to get off the ground, and they finally get this approval. And even if they hadn't already been pinching the pennies, there probably would have been budget overruns anyway, because NASA somewhat underestimated the difficulty of the project they were undertaking. This is a telescope the size of a school bus, okay? It was going to need to survive the trip into orbit with the mirror almost 8 feet across, and that mirror had to be polished to a tolerance of 1/65th the wavelength of infrared light. And then that thing had to be able to point itself at very tiny objects in the faraway sky and track those objects as it moved. We're talking about many, many engineering problems that had not been solved when they started this. They thought they could solve them, but as they started working on it, they came up against a lot of issues that they did not realize they were going to run up against.
I feel like they're going to run out of that $36 million before they have a working prototype.
The largest and most problematic component for the telescope was going to be the mirror, and they knew that right off. And they got 2 different bids. One of them was from Kodak, all right, long-established photography company, knows a lot about lenses, and Kodak said, we're going to make this thing, and we're going to do it old school. Okay, we're going to make it by hand. I don't know exactly what was involved with that, but I do know that Kodak did end up making a backup mirror that would have launched if they had realized that there are problems with the second mirror that they had that was the main mirror. This mirror can now be seen in the Smithsonian, and it has been measured to be perfect without any of the flaws that did end up launching. So their hand grinding would have worked. But the main contract ended up going to a optical design company called Perkin-Elmer. And the Perkin-Elmer Corporation won the bid to produce this mirror. They had previously done a lot of work for the Department of Defense, and they were used to working with that side of government, which was going to be a problem later on. But their proposal was, rather than doing all this boring hand grinding stuff, Tony, they were going to use newfangled computer-controlled grinding.
I mean, in theory, that does sound like it's going to be a lot more accurate than some dude with the hand sander.
It does. It sounds very sexy, right? Even though it's very early in the history of computers, you think they probably can be more precise. And NASA thinks so too, right? They think this is probably a better bet. We're still going to stick with Kodak. Like, they're going to get to make their mirror, but we're going to have Perkins-Elmer be the primary mirror makers. And there's going to be some problems with Perkins-Elmer, but I want to mention they're not a bad company. They were really great experts in the field of optics at the time, but what they weren't experts in was the field of sending things into space. And the technology that they were using to grind the Hubble mirror was new and almost completely untested. So it's probably not surprising that they began to slip behind their projections, both in schedule and budget. And the project heads at NASA became increasingly frustrated as the time went on, and they got further and further over budget and further behind schedule. And the relationship between these two entities that were supposed to be working together became increasingly strained, with NASA demanding that Perkins-Elmer speed up the work and Perkins-Elmer constantly struggling to live up to their promises. So the stage is set here. Perkins-Elmer has said that they can do this new thing. They're running behind. The project is slipping way over budget and way behind time, and they're trying to get this done. So, in their rush to get this project completed and get NASA off their backs, one of the engineers at Perkins-Elmer makes a mistake in the calibration of the mirror. He's using this little sensor that is supposed to be covered so that it does not get any light inside of it, and there's a cap for it that's supposed to be spray painted. And in the process of getting everything done in a rush, he realizes he doesn't have any spray paint, but he thinks, it's okay, I've got some electrical tape, I can block the light out with electrical tape.
Electrical tape going to space, I'm sure that's totally going to hold up to the several G's it takes to get out of the atmosphere.
It wasn't going to space. This is just the testing thing he's working with. But he uses his pocket knife to cut a piece of electrical tape and stick it over this sensor and goes ahead and calibrates the mirror. And what he does not realize is in this process, there's just a tiny little nick in this tape that's letting light through and throwing off the calibration process. And that error led to the mirror being ground with something called a spherical aberration. Essentially, it was just a little bit the wrong shape. And when I say just a little bit, I'm talking about in the realm of like normal people, but in NASA terms, it was light years off, okay? This shape that was supposed to be accurate to 10 nanometers was off by 1.3 millimeters. And for those of you who didn't do well in math, that's 130,000 times off of what it was allowed to be off.
That's just a huge gap. Like, I didn't realize it was that bad.
It was real bad. And the thing is, you'd think, okay, well, this guy made the mistake. He sends the mirror over to NASA. What, did they just accept it? No, they did tests, okay? They did many tests on this mirror, at least several, and when they did the tests, the flaw showed up. This spherical aberration showed up in the tests that NASA did, but the engineers dismissed those findings because the device that was used to create the mirror was supposed to be much more accurate and precise than the devices they were using to measure it to sort of double check. So they came up with all of these explanations about how it's probably just the effect of gravity on this thing and it's not really a big deal, we're okay. And they put this messed up mirror inside the Hubble Space Telescope. Now, this project that is already way behind schedule is set back even further by the Challenger shuttle disaster, which was another victim of this problematic managerial and social structure at NASA at the time, which is why I mention it. The Challenger disaster, which we may go over in a future episode, I'm not sure, there was a technical flaw with the shuttle, but the larger problem that they were dealing with was that some people knew that there was a problem, but they were essentially steamrollered over by people who were just trying to get things done and get up into space and didn't have time for tiny little petty concerns like an O-ring that might fail if it got too cold. By the time the telescope launched in 1990, the project had ballooned. They had expanded their budget somewhat to $400 million for what was allowed, but even that was just blown right past by all of these delays and problems with technology, and it ended up costing $4.7 billion.
That's only 11 and a half times more than the original budget.
Yes, and so you can imagine they're way over budget. These guys watch the shuttle launch. All right, their baby's on there. They're very excited. It gets up into orbit. It's fine. The arm, puts it out of the shuttle bay and launches it into orbit, and this is it. This is the culmination of their dreams. The door on the front of the Hubble telescope opens a little bit, and the image that comes back is just a little bit fuzzy. And the project manager on the Hubble starts worrying. He says, "What's going on with this? Why is this fuzzy?" And he gets reassured, no, it's fine. Just got a little calibration to do. This is expected. We'll be cool. Just, go home, go to bed, come back in the morning. And when he goes to bed, he wakes up in the morning to a phone call from his liaison at Congress asking him if he's seen the morning paper. And the morning paper has the headline about this spherical aberration that they've realized is present in this giant lens that they've sent up into orbit. And all of a sudden, their giant orbiting $4.7 billion telescope is essentially useless.
I wish you had the actual headline for that. Just I'm imagining the spit take that this guy does with his coffee.
It was bad. I mean, it was a cultural sort of whipping boy for a while. Politicians used it if they wanted to talk about how NASA was way over budgets. Comedians made jokes about how silly it was that they had these stupid errors. And it's a rough time for NASA, especially the people that worked on this project. One of the guys who was main head of this project falls ill and dies shortly after they find out about this, probably at least somewhat from the stress, although I'm not drawing a direct link from there to there, but it can't have helped. The other people who survive eventually get escorted out of the building, several of them just for severe alcoholism on the job because of how much stress they're under. And it really becomes apparent that not only was there technical failure, but there was a huge managerial failure. The cost overrun was partly due to Perkins being used to working with these defense contractors. And when you're a defense contractor, you have the luxury of just throwing money at your problems until they go away. Whereas when you're NASA, despite the fact that you might have very large budgets because you're going into space, it's not quite as freewheeling. They still have a lot more transparency and a lot more accountability than when we're going to build a missile and go into, like, blow some people up. For some reason, that gets our goat a little bit more than let's build a satellite and take pictures of stuff with it.
It's like one people are like, oh, like we're actually going to defend the country, and the other's like, oh, I want to see things that are pretty.
Yeah, see, that's the attitude. That's the attitude that gets us in this mess, Tony.
No, believe me, I love NASA, but that's I can see why politicians and people that aren't wanting to spend so much would do that, even though it's only 0.4% of the national budget.
So this relationship between Perkins Elmer and NASA had decayed to the point where NASA was just, screaming at them to get done and spend less money. And Perkins Elmer is like, despite the fact that they're not like a tiny company, they're only allowed to have so many people on this one project. So the people who are on it are worked to the bone. People at NASA are worked to the bone. There's also an issue that comes up with the solar panels on the spacecraft, which were designed in the EU. They find out after it gets up there that when the Hubble spacecraft passes from the light side of the Earth into the dark side of the Earth, that the temperature difference causes those solar panels to warp, and it changes the shape of the telescope just a little bit, so you can't use it in that transitionary period, which is about 10 minutes out of a 96-minute orbit. And you can see where that's a significant problem for people trying to get as much use out of this as they can. NASA does have some opportunities, though. Unlike many of our other episodes of Bad Ideas, this one kind of has a happy ending. I mean, the Hubble telescope. You know that it's not a failure. And the reason it's not a failure is because the spherical aberration that they had in this lens, despite the fact that it was a severe problem, was a severe problem in a very specific way. They had ground it to spec, they just ground it to the wrong spec. So what they needed to do was put in a mirror that exactly counteracted the spherical aberration in the larger mirror. The smaller mirror would make these pictures come back a lot clearer. Before they were able to get this mission up there to fix it, they were also able to correct some photos with computers, because if they were able to take pictures of bright things in the sky, since they knew what the magnitude of this aberration was, they could correct some things and still make some use of the Hubble telescope. But the biggest change that came out of this was that NASA took a serious look at their managerial style, and they started trying to fix that as well as fixing the Hubble. A NASA astrophysicist named Charlie Pellerin made it his mission to change the style of management at NASA from only being focused on scientific and engineering problems to being more focused on human problems like low morale and poor communication. And that is not to say that NASA has been made perfect by this mistake, but it is a great example of somebody looking at a failure, a couple of failures, admittedly, the Challenger was a big part of this as well, and saying, what did we do wrong and how can we do better? Not just in a technical sense, not just in a let's get better O-rings for the shuttle and check that mirror better next time, but actually looking at the human side of what makes those mistakes crop up and fixing that.
Yeah, and it's obvious that they had a lot to fix there. Whenever you've got literal bodies on your hand, you've got to really examine what you're doing.
And let's not discount the, importance of $4.5 billion being spent.
That's the operating budget for many, many countries.
Yes. And I'm glad we have Hubble up there, but it could have been a little bit lower budget. There were other problems besides the low morale, too. There were changes in management throughout the course of the program. So you can imagine a program that starts its life in the early 1970s and doesn't finish until 1990, there's a lot of sort of handoffs of what's going on from head of NASA to head of NASA to head of NASA. And by the time some of these handoffs happen, there are people who are running the program who don't fully understand like why decisions have been made to start with. They're just continuing on practices that had been begun without really having a good handle on what those practices were there for to begin with. So like the Kodak mirror that was made, the full secondary mirror, there's speculation that that was never supposed to actually fully get built. But at some point, someone said, they've already designed it and have the specs, why don't we just have them go ahead and build one too? And that contributed to cost overrun as well.
Either way, I'm just glad that NASA was able to figure out what was going on with their management structure. Even if there was a lot of costs associated here, it sounds like they also learned enough about the business of space to kind of make up for some of the mistakes that they made here. A lot of times these really good ideas have bad implementation, and that's whenever they become sort of bad ideas, and I'm glad that they were able to actually recover on this one, because this is a very important thing for humanity to be able to see some of these, like the deep field photograph, and just some of the incredible images that popped up. I know that the Hubble has been replaced by some higher tech these days, but it's still in use today. Like, we've gotten almost 3 decades of use out of it.
And it was only planned to be 15 years, so
yes.
Really has... I don't know if I could 100% say we got our money's worth, but it has lasted longer than they expected. And in addition to that, the lessons that NASA learned are lessons that everybody can apply to their lives. This guy, Charlie Pellerin, now has a business where he goes around helping companies that have similar problems fix their issues. And you can learn from other people's mistakes.
I want to give a big shout out to Leonard Waters II, LW, on Twitter. He was the one who suggested this episode, and we decided to run with it because we were looking at a bunch of different ideas, and it just kind of grabbed us. So thank you very much.
It grabbed me especially because I did not realize that this problem had existed at all. For my entire life, I knew of the Hubble as a success, and to know that it started its life out as a failure and was able to be retrofitted and changed and get better was a fascinating story, and I really wanted to dig into it.
Yeah, so thank you very much for tossing that idea to us. If you have ideas for the show, hit us up at Human Echoes or badideasshow@gmail.com. Thank you all for listening. Thank you for being a part of this. If you want to support the show, check out our Patreon at patreon.com/Human Echoes. We would greatly appreciate it. It starts at $2, $5, $10. It goes up from there, depending on what you want. We've got a bunch of pins, we've got shirts, we've got all sorts of things that are part of becoming a new patron. And I hope you guys have an excellent week. We will be back with more bad ideas next week.
Bye.